town of Elridge never imagined a simple delivery route could hide something so dark, but everything changed the night Darren Holt, a quiet and hardworking pizza driver, was found lying beside his car on a lonely dirt road. Darren had spent years delivering meals without trouble, saving every dollar to fulfill his dream of owning a small food truck. He worked late nights, took extra shifts, and accepted routes that others avoided. Out of all the addresses on his delivery list, one appeared more often than any other: Lydia Mercer's old farmhouse at the edge of the fields. She ordered the same pizza several times a week, always at the same time, always requesting that it be left on a rusted table by the door. Darren didn't think much of it. A consistent customer meant reliable tips, and Lydia's tips were generous enough that he never questioned her routine. But the more he delivered, the stranger the atmosphere around the property felt. The farmhouse always seemed dim, even with its porch light on. The windows were covered with heavy curtains that never moved, and the yard looked untouched, as though no one lived there at all. Darren told himself he was imagining things, even when he occasionally felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched from behind the glass. One evening, he noticed something that made him pause: a small envelope taped to the metal table. Inside was a blurry photo of him stepping out of his car. He tried to convince himself it was a joke or a mistake, but the angle suggested someone had been standing in the darkness, photographing him without his knowledge. He tucked the photo away and continued working, unaware that Lydia was observing his every delivery from inside her house. Lydia rarely left her home, and over time she developed a distorted fascination with Darren. She monitored her porch through old security cameras and saved every clip of him arriving. In her isolated mind, a simple delivery pattern turned into a threat. She convinced herself that Darren was coming too often, not because she ordered frequently, but because he was studying her, watching her, planning something she couldn't explain. The more she fueled these thoughts, the more real they became to her. She cleaned her late father's rifle, pacing the house at night, imagining dangers that didn't exist. On Darren's final night, he accepted Lydia's order like always. Nothing about it seemed unusual. The road was quiet, the fields cold under the November wind. He placed the pizza on the table and turned away, ready to finish his shift. That was when Lydia stepped out, holding the rifle with both hands, seeing him not as a delivery driver, but as the danger she had built up in her mind. Darren didn't have time to react. The shot echoed across the empty land, and the stillness that followed was almost unnatural. When police arrived, they found Lydia sitting calmly on the porch, the rifle beside her, convinced she had protected herself from a threat that never existed. Darren became a tragic reminder of how a harmless routine can turn deadly in the mind of someone lost in their own fear. That I end the days following Darren's death. The town of Elridge was shaken by the details that emerged from the investigation. What seemed at first like a tragic misunderstanding soon revealed deeper layers of obsession, fear, and isolation that had built up inside Lydia Mercer's home long before the final shot was fired. Detectives searched her farmhouse carefully, expecting to find signs of a break-in or intruder that might explain her panic, but instead they found evidence that pointed in a very different direction. Inside her living room, stacks of old notebooks filled with shaky handwriting covered a small desk. Each notebook documented Lydia's thoughts, her suspicions, and the strange patterns she believed she saw in Darren's deliveries. She had written down the times he arrived, the clothes he wore, the angle of his car in the driveway, and even the direction he looked when placing the pizza on the table. What Darren considered part of his simple, repetitive job had transformed in her mind into a chain of warnings she believed she needed to analyze for her own safety. Her kitchen held a pile of printed screenshots from security footage she had recorded over months. Every visit was captured and reviewed repeatedly. Some photos were marked with circles and arrows pointing at tiny details, shadows, reflections, and shapes that meant nothing to anyone else but convinced her she was being watched. The hard drive connected to her old security system contained countless clips of Darren walking to the porch, setting down the pizza, and leaving without hesitation. To investigators, the behavior was normal. To Lydia, each clip added to a story she had created, one where she was the target of someone she believed visited too often to be harmless. People in town remembered Lydia's past differently. Some recalled that she had once been social, volunteering at events, and visiting the local library every week. Others said she started withdrawing years ago after losing several family members in quick succession. Living alone on a property far from neighbors allowed her isolation to grow unnoticed. Even when her behavior shifted from quiet to erratic, no one saw the warning signs. Her isolation became the perfect environment for her fears to expand without challenge. The notebooks revealed how her thoughts spiraled, turning innocent moments into imagined threats. A car backfiring in the distance became a signal. A stray dog crossing her yard became a scout sent by someone unknown. Everything fed her anxiety until she believed that Darren, the only person who approached her home regularly, had a hidden purpose. The investigators pieced together her mental decline through the items scattered across her home. Old prescription bottles, unopened mail, and fading photographs hinted at a life once filled with connection but slowly drained of it. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that her fear had not appeared suddenly. It had grown quietly, unnoticed by anyone who could have helped. Darren had simply been the one who unknowingly walked into the path of her collapsing reality. She didn't choose him. He was simply the only consistent presence in her isolated world, a familiar face her mind twisted into the shape of a threat. The tragedy was not in a feud or motive, but in two lives crossing at the wrong time, under the worst possible circumstances. As news of the investigation spread, Elridge tried to move forward, but the shock settled like a heavy fog over the town. The police continued digging through every piece of evidence from Lydia's farmhouse, while Darren's family struggled to understand how an ordinary delivery route had led to their son's death. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that the tragedy was shaped not by a single moment, but by a series of small, unnoticed signs that had built up over time. Detectives focused on understanding the exact path that led Lydia from quiet living to a fatal act. They believed that if they could trace her mental decline more precisely, they might prevent similar incidents in the future. One of the detectives, who had worked several cases involving psychological deterioration, studied Lydia's routines. He discovered that her decline had intensified after a storm the previous year that caused a long power outage on her property. The sudden darkness, loss of communication devices, and isolation during the storm had left her terrified. According to notes in her journals, that event triggered her belief that someone was targeting her. She wrote repeatedly about hearing footsteps outside her window during those nights, though no one could confirm if the sounds were real or imagined. After electricity returned, she installed more cameras and motion detectors around her home. Most of the equipment wasn't connected properly, but she believed it kept her safe. That belief eventually shifted into paranoia, pushing her to interpret every shadow as a signal. Darren's face became familiar simply because he appeared more than anyone else. Lydia's notes showed that at first she appreciated his reliability, even writing that his visits made the evenings feel less lonely. But as her fears grew, her interpretation changed. She convinced herself that he knew too much about her routines, that he was returning too regularly for it to be accidental, and that he might be working with someone unseen. The frequency of her pizza orders increased not because she wanted the food, but because she wanted to track his pattern and confirm her suspicions. Each order became an experiment in her mind, a way to observe what she believed was a planned intrusion. The fact that Darren treated every delivery the same only intensified her confusion. While investigators unraveled the threads of Lydia's thoughts, the town held a memorial for Darren. Hundreds showed up, co-workers, customers, friends from school, and strangers who simply admired the kindness he always showed people. Stories were shared about how he helped elderly customers carry groceries, stayed late to assist co-workers, and often gave part of his tips to charity drives. The memorial painted a picture of a young man whose life centered on hard work and kindness, making his death even harder for the community to process. His parents stood quietly, overwhelmed by the love people showed their son. The contrast between Darren's generosity and Lydia's fear created a sorrow that no one could fully put into words. Meanwhile, experts reviewed Lydia's case to determine whether she understood the consequences of her actions. They concluded that she lived in a world shaped almost entirely by her own imagination. Reality and fear blended together until she could no longer tell them apart. The system had failed to reach her before the tragedy unfolded, and the town realized how easily isolation could turn dangerous when left unaddressed. In the end, The chapter of their lives marked by the loss of Darren became a reminder that unseen struggles can be as dangerous as any weapon, especially when no one knows they exist. The legal process began slowly, as specialists evaluated Lydia to determine her mental state during the shooting. While the town waited for updates, investigators continued piecing together the final elements of the case. They reviewed interviews with neighbors, though few had spoken to Lydia in recent years. Most recalled seeing her only from a distance, usually tending to her yard alone or checking her mailbox at odd hours. Some mentioned hearing strange noises from her property at night, but none suspected the depth of her distress. The community hadn't ignored her intentionally, they simply assumed she preferred solitude. Only now did they realize how dangerous that solitude had become. During their search, investigators discovered a small shed behind Lydia's house filled with equipment she had collected over the years: broken radios, old computer parts, and several outdated cameras. Many of these items were stacked haphazardly, covered in dust. Yet Lydia had labeled them with phrases like backup surveillance and emergency communication. These labels reflected her belief that she was preparing for something, though no one could determine exactly what she feared. Her journals indicated that she thought someone was planning to breach her home, but the entries never identified who. Instead, they referenced vague descriptions of shadows, figures she claimed followed her in the past, and messages she believed were hidden in everyday noises. She interpreted flickering lights, barking dogs, and even weather changes as signs of danger approaching. As forensic psychologists reviewed this material, they identified a pattern common in severe paranoia, a belief system built entirely on misinterpretations. Lydia wasn't reacting to real threats, she was responding to imagined ones. The presence of a single consistent person, Darren, became the anchor for these thoughts. According to her writings, she believed Darren was testing her defenses with each delivery. She interpreted his polite routine as deliberate observation. She read meaning into the way he parked his car or where he set the pizza box. The more regular his visits became, the more convinced she grew that he represented a hidden danger. In her mind, the repetition wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. While investigators worked to understand Lydia's perspective, Darren's family tried to rebuild their lives. His parents, overwhelmed by grief, turned to the community for support. Friends organized fundraisers in his name to help cover funeral expenses and to start a scholarship for local students pursuing culinary careers, honoring Darren's dream of owning a food truck. These efforts brought comfort, but they also emphasized the loss of a young man with a bright future. Every donation, every message, and every memory shared reminded them of how deeply he had touched the lives of those around him. As the case progressed, the district attorney announced that Lydia would not face a traditional trial. Experts concluded she was not mentally capable of understanding her actions at the time of the shooting. Instead, she would be placed in a secure psychiatric facility, where she would receive long-term treatment. The decision sparked mixed reactions. Some residents felt justice was incomplete, believing that a life was still lost and someone should be held accountable. Others recognized the truth. Lydia had never intended harm in the way most criminals do. She had acted out of a distorted reality built by years of untreated mental illness. The town struggled with the outcome, unsure how to move forward. The tragedy highlighted painful questions about mental health, isolation, and the consequences of ignoring early warning signs. People began checking on neighbors more often, especially those who lived alone. Small acts of compassion became part of daily life. Offers of help, invitations to community events, and simple conversations that once seemed unnecessary. The memory of what happened served as a silent encouragement to pay attention before fear turned into irreversible tragedy. With Lydia relocated to a secure psychiatric facility and the investigation officially closed, Elridge tried to reclaim a sense of normalcy, though the scars left by the tragedy lingered quietly across the community. Darren's absence was felt most strongly at the pizza shop where he had worked for years. His co-workers struggled to adjust to the empty space in the kitchen and the routes that used to belong to him. The chair he pulled up during short breaks remained untouched out of respect, and his locker was left exactly as he had last closed it. Customers continued asking for him weeks after the incident, some unaware of what had happened, others hoping to offer condolences. The shop's atmosphere changed, not through fear, but through a deep sense of loss. It reminded everyone how tragedy could strike in the most ordinary corners of life. Meanwhile, Staff at the psychiatric facility began documenting Lydia's progress. Upon admission, she remained convinced that she had been in danger and believed that every noise she heard on the ground signaled another threat. Her doctors noted that she was locked inside the same patterns of thought that had shaped her actions. It took weeks of observation and treatment before they noticed even small shifts in her understanding. As therapy sessions continued, fragments of clarity emerged, though they came slowly and unpredictably. On certain days, she appeared aware that something terrible had occurred, but she couldn't fully recall the motivations behind her fear. On other days, she slipped back into the belief that hidden enemies still watched her. While her progress was fragile, it was evidence that her mind could gradually untangle itself from the world she had created. In the community, a renewed focus on mental health began taking shape. Local leaders, schools, and churches organized discussions about recognizing early signs of psychological distress. Residents who had never spoken openly about such topics found themselves sharing stories, discovering they had overlooked similar struggles in others before. The tragedy opened a space for compassion that had long been missing. Teachers checked in more often with isolated students, neighbors extended casual invitations to those who lived alone, and families reconsidered how they responded to relatives who showed signs of withdrawal. People understood that isolation didn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it simply looked like distance, and distance could grow into danger if unnoticed. Darren's parents worked quietly behind the scenes, channeling their grief into something meaningful. They partnered with local organizations to create a community fund called the Holt Outreach Program. Its goal was simple: to support individuals dealing with isolation, anxiety, or early symptoms of mental health struggles. The fund provided resources like counseling vouchers, transportation assistance for appointments, and workshops aimed at building stronger social connections. The initiative gained momentum quickly because many recognized its purpose as a direct response to what had been overlooked in Lydia's life. As months passed, the town slowly mended. New traditions formed, such as an annual memorial run in Darren's honor and a candlelight vigil held near the fields where he had delivered his last order. These events brought residents together, not just to remember, but to reaffirm their commitment to preventing such tragedies in the future. Though the pain of the loss never disappeared entirely, it became a reminder of how fragile life could be and how easily tragedy could grow out of silence. In the end, Elridge learned that tragedy was not only the moment when a life was taken, but also the quiet years leading up to it. The unspoken struggles, the unnoticed warnings, and the loneliness that allowed fear to take root. Darren's story became a lasting symbol of why communities must look out for one another before isolation turns into something irreversible.